minute or two to allow people to join. We've got a few last minute folks who are joining, so we'll kick off the webinar in just 1 or 2 minutes here, so hang tight. All right, well, that probably gives us enough time. Hopefully everybody has joined in. We'll probably get a few late people, but they'll probably come in through my introduction, which isn't the important part. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to another session of the Atlantic BioCon Virtual Speaker Series. I hope everybody is doing well. My name is Rod Badcock. I'm a principal partner at BioApply, which is a consulting firm that specializes in innovation and renewable resource industries. And as part of that role, I'm also the executive director of the Nova Scotia Innovation Hub. And I'm going to be your host here for the next hour. Before we kick off, just a few housekeeping items. The first is the session is being recorded, and our plan is to make this available through our social media channels. So have a look through that, through our own channels, but as well as that of our partners, who I'll introduce shortly. And we'll be sure to let you know over email how you can access this. Also, after the presentation, we'll do a question and answer period. What we'd ask you to do is, as you're thinking of questions going through the session, please record them in the Q&A menu feature. Should be at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little Q&A box. If you click on that, you can enter questions. We'll do our best to answer all of the questions. Typically, we run out of time before that happens. If there are questions that we don't get to, we'll try our best to follow up. I would also like to, while we're talking, put in a quick plug for our next series. Might be bad form to plug a new webinar while we're talking about this one, but we've got another one coming up in September. The date is being confirmed, but we're going to have Dr. Stephanie McCory and Dr. Audrey Moores, who will team up to talk about their work creating high-value products from crab waste and an invasive crab species. So if you've got an interest in the ocean space, stay tuned. We'll be back with a very interesting webinar in September as well. At this point, I'd also like to introduce the partners. There's a lot of people who work in the background to make this virtual speaker series work, including CCNB-Innov, BioNB, and Ignite Atlantic. We're very pleased to work with those organizations to offer this. So today what we're doing is hosting our third session, and we've invited Chelsea Bryant from Radicle to speak on the impacts of COVID-19 on environmental commodities markets. A little background on Chelsea: she serves as the Managing Director of Global Markets and Strategy at Radicle. She's been doing this for over 12 years, and she has experience in commodity markets, investments, and trading, which already tells me she's smarter than I am. Chelsea's areas of focus include carbon market design, environmental commodity generation, transition structures, and hedging strategy. Prior to joining Radicle, she led a team focused on environmental commodity advisory services and managed the environmental commodity profile for a large regulated entity with operations throughout North America. She's got a Bachelor in Science and Mathematics from the University of Alberta. She's also a chartered financial analyst. And when she's not expounding on carbon markets for Radicle's clients, she loves being surrounded by nature on the acreage where she abides, which she told me here this afternoon is just outside of beautiful Calgary. So, I think today's topic is very thought-provoking, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're almost certainly facing a new reality as the world emerges from the pandemic, and hopefully that happens sooner than later. But we're probably looking at a world where there's less travel, and perhaps as a result of that, lower greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, there's the whole notion of global economic recovery and what will drive this. And I'm sure many people are wondering, as I am, what this means for climate change policy, projects and markets, which are, of course, very closely tied to environmental commodity markets. So I think the questions are, will they take a back seat or will they accelerate as a means to boost recovery? So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chelsea to help us tackle these questions. Thank her for being here. And Chelsea, I'm going to turn it over to you now to dive in on what I think is going to be a fascinating topic.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Rod. I'm looking forward to diving in. It's a very interesting time globally, certainly across a variety of commodities, and environmental are no different. So I'm just going to share my presentation here. And give me 1 second. And is that showing it on the full screen?
Sure is, Chelsea.
Wonderful, thank you. So we've got quite a meaty topic to dive into today. And I thought I'd start with a global macro overview of environmental commodity markets from a compliance scale to give that context to frame the conversation. And then we'd spend some time talking about environmental commodity trading and the key drivers of environmental commodity prices. Then we're going to touch on the concept of green reboot, which has been a very prevalent topic coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and what that looks like going forward. And then talk about the short-term impacts of COVID-19 specifically on environmental commodity prices. Finally, I think it's a good time to give a regulatory update on Canada and specifically on the Atlantic provinces, because we have quite a lot of regulatory movement on environmental commodity pricing within our country currently. And then what's next? A quick overview for Radicle, for those of you that aren't familiar with our organization. We've been developing and creating environmental commodities for over 12 years, specifically in the biological carbon space, which has a significant amount of complexity and data points around the quantification of the associated environmental commodities. And so because of the complexity of that, our organization developed one of the world's first software platforms to measure, qualify, and aggregate GHG emissions. I joined the team in February of 2020, and coming from a trading background, one of the greatest causes of heartburn in environmental commodities is this sometimes hard to quantify technical risk of invalidation of credits, and we'll get a little more into that a little bit later in the presentation. But Radicle developing a platform to streamline the process and simplify the creation of the credits, so mitigating that technical risk, was a significant sort of step change in what I'd seen in the market. Our organization has serviced over 3,000 clients, and our team has actually transacted in excess of $300 million in environmental commodities to date. So starting with that global macro view on carbon markets, we see these numbers increase every single year. The World Bank puts out a States and Trends report that shows for each fiscal year the amount of carbon pricing initiatives that are in place, and so we've slowly been seeing that number tick up. And so now globally, we have over 61 carbon pricing initiatives that are either implemented or scheduled. Interestingly enough, that's almost completely split 50-50 between emissions trading systems. So if you think of a cap and trade program, or what you call a traditional carbon market, and carbon tax systems. The difference between a cap and trade or carbon market is where you have a specific level of credits that can be bought in the market, and the price can vary for those credits based on the fundamentals of that associated market. Where a carbon tax typically sets that price for carbon, but then you have access or the ability to emit more. Systems like Canada are what I would call a hybrid system, where you have a combination of a ceiling price and also the ability to use credits in meeting your compliance. So you do have some overlap between those two system designs or concepts. Right now, we have approximately 1/5 of global emissions covered under these GHG systems. And I'm sure the group here has read a lot of literature about how those specific systems in aggregate will not get us to the required emission reductions for a 2-degree scenario. So there's a lot of work to come, and we expect this number and the stringencies of these systems to continue to increase over time. The systems themselves have created over $45 billion in carbon pricing revenues in 2019. This is particularly interesting because not all of those revenues are allocated towards emission reduction projects. A substantive part of that revenue actually goes into the general revenue for different jurisdictions. And so, as you can see, these systems or these programs generate a substantive amount of revenue that can also drive incremental emission reductions, but provide a substantive source of revenue for governments. And we've seen over or close to 15,000 registered projects to date, and that creates almost 4 billion tons of carbon credits. Interestingly enough, the forestry sector makes close to half of all the credits issued in the last 5 years, and we're continuing to see that trend increase where incremental volume is coming from the forestry sector. And there's a significant focus on nature-based solutions, which again ties into the concept of biological carbon and some of the complexities of those specific environmental commodities to create that I discussed before. So talking about environmental commodity trading, it's really important when you're looking at these markets that we understand that a vast majority of them are quite illiquid and opaque and trade over the counter. There are examples of secondary markets where credits trade on an exchange, but the vast majority of carbon offsets that are created globally are traded in over-the-counter fashion through bilateral agreements. And so access to the market becomes a lot more complicated than if you think of a stock exchange as an example. And so the first step when you're thinking about environmental commodity trading is really understanding and setting a trading strategy and completing a risk assessment to understand how you want to engage in the market. So specifically when you're thinking about risks and trading strategy, things like what transaction structures as an organization are you willing to enter into? So is it just simply spot transactions where you're entering into the market at a single point in time? Is it looking at forward transactions and strips where you could be doing a multi-year purchase or sale of environmental commodities? Is it in options, call options, put options, looking to specifically deal with your exposure and risk that way? There's a variety of different transactions that are entered into, and because these are all dealt with in bilateral agreements for the most part, you really have complete flexibility in how you originate these specific deal structures, depending on what other market participants are willing to do. Consideration of things like that technical risk that I talked about, or the invalidation risk. So specifically around carbon offsets, regulators can come in and review a project and decide that it is not technically valid enough, and those credits can be invalidated. So we have seen those events historically in certain jurisdictions under certain systems. And so specific to the system, there's different types of understanding around that invalidation risk and what that specifically means to an organization that's transacting. But it really ties into the technical work that goes into quantifying, measuring and reporting the associated emission reductions and how that's done, and ensuring that that is done in a way that can be verified and continue to be audited effectively without running into specific errors around those projects. Looking at policy risk. So this is a really important one, and I'll park that for a moment because we'll talk about that a little bit later in the slide deck, but that's a very, very key component of environmental commodity pricing. Counterparty risk. So the counterparty you're dealing with, but also understanding what jurisdictions the prevailing law is that you're specifically transacting in are also extraordinarily important. Force majeure definition has become a really interesting topic with the onset of the Covid-19 pandemic. So an expansion of that definition, or understanding how pandemic conditions could be considered force majeure and how that's been disruptive, specifically to contracts globally, and operational risk around the creation of those credits. So there's a variety of different things that need to be assessed and understood when you're setting up that trading strategy and how you want to specifically transact in the markets. And that feeds into the next step, which is your commercial negotiation. It's the origination of a specific transaction, the negotiation of the terms and conditions of that transaction. So because it's not necessarily on an exchange and you're really dealing with a variety of different counterparties, it's incumbent on the person that's participating in the market to originate the associated transaction and then to negotiate the associated terms and conditions of that transaction. And this is where, when we have opaque and illiquid markets, there can be a considerable variation in environmental commodity prices. Once you've negotiated the terms and conditions, you then actually go into and negotiate the legal language within the contract that's reflecting those commercial conditions. And assuming that you agree to that, you would then execute a purchase sales agreement between a seller and buyer. Once that it's in place in the future, or if you do a transaction that you're immediately going to be delivering on, you then have the delivery and payment conditions for that specific transaction. So what are those key drivers of price? Obviously, supply and demand fundamentals are key to any market. In environmental commodity markets, it's particularly interesting. When we looked at that global picture of all of the different programs that were in place, and Canada is really a microcosm of the global picture because every jurisdiction, for the most part, set up their own carbon pricing system. And when you create credits in one jurisdiction, that doesn't mean, and in most cases they are not, fungible into another jurisdiction. Over time, regulatory bodies can decide to link programs. We saw that happen with California and Quebec as an example, where they linked their systems, and now their credits are fungible between those two jurisdictions. But oftentimes these programs can work in isolation. So because I'm sitting in Calgary, I will point to Alberta. Alberta has the oldest carbon trading system in North America. It was the first, and it has always been a system where you can only create credits from projects that are located within the province, and you can only use those credits against compliance obligations within this province as well. So that's an example of a system that works in isolation where it's not fungible with other systems, but over time there can be linkage agreements between different provinces or governments. And certainly as we talk and look into the future of environmental commodity markets, we're seeing that. The other part that I think it's really important to understand is when you're looking at, say, a low carbon environmental commodity like a biofuel, when we see this happen, you may not have markets that are fungible, but if you have the flexibility to deliver into multiple markets with your activity, you can optimize the price that you receive for that commodity depending on each jurisdiction's rules. So if you create the commodity and it's applicable, as an example, in California as well as British Columbia, you could choose which market you wanted to sell that into in that case. And as we see a clean fuel standard obviously evolving in Canada, that would be another example. And so that's where you're looking at multiple jurisdictions and saying, I'm going to optimize the sale of my particular environmental commodity based on the applicability of it under multiple systems, even though those systems themselves aren't linked and don't trade with each other. And all those pieces ultimately feed into the market fundamentals picture, the supply and the demand of the market. Demand in environmental commodities can be clearly delineated between compliance demand, so that's where you have regulated parties that have a regulatory requirement to reduce emissions or to buy a specific commodity, and they participate in the market as a result of that regulatory requirement, and the regulation clearly defines what supply meets those requirements. Conversely, there's also voluntary demand, so that means that there's organizations, consumers, corporates, utilities that are making voluntary commitments to use environmental commodities, and they form a different component of demand. Historically, voluntary demand has been at a lower price than compliance demand, but there actually have been certain cases, and we've seen this in Alberta, where voluntary demand has actually poached compliance supply because the price was in excess of the compliance price at that time. So there are examples, and really, again, it's about an optimization activity. You create a commodity, you obviously want to sell it at the highest price. The market supply will then optimize its sales into those higher price markets. If the voluntary demand, as an example, exceeds a compliance price, it can take away supply from otherwise compliance entities that would buy it. The supply itself is predicated on approved protocols and pathways. It can also, and we're seeing a significant focus on this now, around the concept of insetting. So when you're an organization looking at your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and you have the ability to drive emission reductions through specific project investments within your supply chain, you can then see outside of an approved protocol or pathway the creation of what we would call, say, an insetting reduction. And there's a lot of information still to be defined about that, but it is another source of supply that's outside of creating what I would call a serialized environmental commodity to meet specific demand for corporates. They could otherwise secure serialized credits to meet that demand. Lying between these two pieces of supply and demand are three key considerations when you're looking at the drivers of price. The number one impact is policy risk. So when we look at compliance demand, it is entirely predicated on the regulatory design of the system. If you start pulling regulatory levers, and we have seen this with changes of government being a key example, I'll point to Ontario having had a cap and trade program that was abolished overnight and have now transitioned into, well, they've developed their own system, but it's not in place. They're currently under the federal output-based pricing system. So that's an example of how you had a change in government, immediately had a policy canceled, all the associated commodities in that program were effectively rendered to have no value, and it had sort of, I would call, substantive disruptions into that market certainly, but even into the markets it was linked to. That's a key example of policy risk, where if you only have one option for selling your associated environmental commodity, and you have something like that where you have a government change, you are facing a substantive amount of risk and a very substantive amount of risk to the associated commodity price that you're dealing with. Counterparty risk is another important piece. And it's obviously dependent on the size of your transaction, because smaller transactions are a lot less likely that you would go from taking a legal position on just because it wouldn't be worth the cost. But certainly for a large exposure, understanding the provisions of your contract and your specific exposure to your counterparty is extraordinarily important. If you have a large creditworthy counterparty versus a smaller counterparty, you might have very substantive differences in your exposure if there was any risk associated with the environmental commodities that you're transacting. And I did touch on technical risk, and this is really around project invalidation. So is your project done in a way, especially if you have these very complex projects, where you can be verified and then audited over time and not run into a situation where an audit finding has a material discrepancy that could lead to the project being invalidated. It's a very important key aspect of environmental commodities, and sometimes challenging to do the due diligence on as a potential market participant. The other pieces that I think are important to touch on from an environmental commodity price are demand in markets, in particular for environmental commodities, because they are liquid, are quite cyclical. So market timing in terms of your overarching trading strategy is extraordinarily important to optimize the position you have in the market. The other piece I'd say is commercial positioning. So even your overarching trading strategy and how you decide to engage in the market, and the transparency of your position in the market. Because again, if you're talking about markets that only have a few market participants, or they have a lack of liquidity, how you position yourself in the market is incredibly important in terms of, again, the ultimate price that you're going to be transacting at. So as an example, if you were to create a substantive amount of supply in a market, and then announce to the entire market that you were then going to be transacting or selling your credits, that announcement in and of itself could actually drive down the price of the market. So depending on the illiquidity and the amount of market participants, the specific positioning of an organization and how they engage with the market is very important in terms of optimizing market price. One of the things that's obviously been really interesting as we talk about COVID-19 is a concept of green reboot. I've read a lot of articles throughout the last few months around this concept, and I decided a word cloud would demonstrate sort of the types of language that we're specifically seeing. So carbon transaction, green economy, sustainable projects, green financing hub, sustainable investment opportunities, greater resilience. So there's a lot of great language around the concept of a green reboot and what that means, but from a pragmatic standpoint, I always go back to, in practical terms, what could a green reboot mean? So when you see a massive disruption to the economy the way we have with COVID-19, and the level of funding that's coming from governments in order to deal with the very significant challenges we're facing, the concept of a green reboot really means looking at an economic recovery plan that aims to accelerate that green shift. So if there's a substantive amount of funding that's going to be spent, is there ways to effectively invest the funding to drive that green reboot, increase the use of clean energy while reducing dependence on fossil fuels, as an example. And so the questions I ask are, what are the logistics of a green reboot? So what is the infrastructure needs? As we transition to a cleaner future, what are the overarching impacts of those changes when we look at the system as a whole? So a perfect example of this would be as we transition to more renewable energy. As you're looking at the incumbent electric system operators, are the systems set up in a way that effectively manage the transition to renewable energy? Or are there changes that need to be made because you have a change in the electricity generation profile from these technologies? Does that change over time? And certainly it will, as we get better battery storage technologies that pair with renewable energy. So there's a lot of really interesting infrastructure questions that need to be addressed and considered as we look at a green reboot transition with a focus on economic resiliency. The second question is, where's the money? So when you're looking at the grant money that the governments are allocating, how can that money be spent effectively to enable a green reboot? And this is obviously critical and probably top of mind to a lot of the regulators that are talking about these concepts. And then also, where is the inertia? So ultimately, we need to see widespread stakeholder buy-in to effectively manage a concept like a green reboot. You need to ensure that all of the stakeholder groups are in alignment with the solutions. In cases where they aren't, we see significant public pressure or backlash, and we have seen these examples where it's led to policy risks. So I think Ontario is a unique example of this, where there was a public frustration with some of the green policies that have been put into place over time that ultimately led to a change in government. There's obviously a lot of other ancillary things outside of climate policy that leads to that kind of change, but it was certainly a contributing factor in Ontario. And then as a result, the government change led to a substantive step change in the regulatory design in that jurisdiction and quite a large disruption to environmental commodity markets. So it's really important to understand where the widespread stakeholders are in this discussion and ensure alignment to effectively enable these types of policies to move forward. So I thought it was important, and obviously very much tied to the topic of today's discussion, to dive into the details of what the short-term impact of COVID-19 has been on environmental commodity prices. We talked about compliance and voluntary demand and how they're different. Specifically to compliance demand, we've seen a reduction in global emissions as a result of COVID-19. And that certainly reduced the overarching demand for environmental commodities under regulations. So if you're a part of a cap and trade system and your economy reduces, or your economic activity reduces, you certainly see a reduction in emissions and associated reduction in demand for the associated commodities in that jurisdiction. So in cap and trade, it would typically be allowances and offsets. Another example of this could be a market like CORSIA, so that's your global aviation scheme. Certainly the airline sector or the aviation sector has had one of the most massive disruptions as a result of COVID-19, and there's no clear picture as to exactly when we would expect business as usual, if at all, to resume in that sector. And so as a result, a program that covered the global aviation sector has seen a substantive change in what the associated demand was expected to be. And that in and of itself actually ties into a discussion about supply, but I'll park that for 1 minute. Voluntary demand at the same time is obviously going to be reduced to a certain extent because we see a reduction in emissions. Again, economic downturns lead to a reduction in emissions. But it wasn't as prevalent as compliance demand because we actually continue to see a large amount of corporates commit to emission reduction targets and higher levels of stringency. So we've really seen a continuation of a bullish trend in environmental commodities, which is over time, more corporations, more individuals are committing to more stringent targets for emission reductions. So we are seeing significant amount of that. At the same time, regulations have emission reduction targets that get more stringent over time as well. So although you might have a short-term impact from COVID-19 that reduces the demand for those instruments, in the mid to long term, you have a substantive amount of emission reduction targets that are in place globally that need to be met, and that drives up demand. So the mid to long-term trends are bullish for environmental commodities as a result. And certainly we need to see some substantive technology innovation over time to be getting to a net zero 2050 goal. The other piece would be supply. So when you have a reduction in demand, oftentimes you would see an associated reduction in price. The reduction in price in and of itself acts as a mechanism to suppress supply because specific supply sources will only come to market at specific price levels. And so as a result of this, the reduction in demand and a suppression in pricing, and I'll point to CORSIA as an example, there was an anticipation of a very substantive price on CORSIA eligible credits. As a result of COVID-19, that demand has reduced and the price is reduced. Supply that was expecting to meet a substantively higher price level now won't necessarily come to market because the price signal does not incentivize it to do so. So that's an example of how supply is self-corrected as a result of a suppression in pricing. Policy risk has caused, I would say, a small downward pressure on pricing in the short term, only insofar that we've seen systems like CORSIA change where their benchmark is, so that's a decrease in demand. Ultimately, that system had to change or it was going to have much larger problems as a result of what's happening. But also compliance deadline extensions. So we see deadline extensions across multiple systems because compliance entities that fall under these systems are obviously facing significant financial pressures in the short term. The associated deadline extension just simply pushes out that demand into a different cycle for the cyclicality of the demand cycle that I mentioned before. And so you just have a different timing for that specific price. So it's more of a delay than an overarching suppression of price into the mid to long term. We've also seen systems say that they were going to plan to have an increase in price and now they've frozen that price for a period of time. So again, ultimately we're talking about delay as opposed to a mid to long term bearish signal on price. But the piece that's really interesting is when we talk about a green reboot, and the devil is all in the details, which is why I have this lovely question mark in the table. What does that look like? Because if we are incentivizing these kinds of changes through markets, ultimately the demand can go up substantively as a result of that. And that drives the correct financial signal to have these types of projects built and these types of transitions happen. And at the end of the day, ultimately that is bullish for environmental commodity pricing, but it's very specific to the program that it applies to. So is it saying we want to incentivize this type of renewable energy development in this jurisdiction? Is that going to be specifically like a government contract? Is it going to be an environmental commodity price that's going to dictate that that is a project that makes sense that's going to be built? All those details need to be worked out on what specifically the reduction activity is intended to be, and then what's the associated regulatory mechanism? Is it a command and control regulation? Is it a market? Is it a carbon tax? Is it a government funded grant? What does that look like? What are the drivers to create that change? because of everyone's focus on, or I should say the assumption that everyone on the call today is associated with a Canadian company that's exposed to Canadian carbon pricing, I wanted to give a regulatory update. So quickly touching on Atlantic Canada carbon programs, we can see we have, again, that sort of microcosm of the global sphere, different carbon pricing systems based on each of the provinces. So two of these jurisdictions, New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, fall under the federal backstop, which means they are under the federal output-based pricing system specifically. And two of the jurisdictions have developed their own systems. One of them being a cap and trade system and one of them being a carbon tax system. So again, we're talking about multiple permutations. And although the federal system is loosely classified as a carbon tax, and certainly because we don't have a credit supply right now functions as a carbon tax, it is a hybrid system, much the same as Alberta's, where there's going to be environmental commodities that can be purchased to meet compliance. So I would call that a hybrid system. The federal government has mandated a minimum price on carbon that ratchets up by $10 per year up to $50 a ton in 2022. And each individual jurisdiction that has their own system, if it's a carbon tax or a hybrid program, has to match that minimum price. If you have a cap and trade system like Nova Scotia, you have the flexibility not to have that minimum price in place, but you have to have a stringent emission reduction trajectory for your specific system to meet the requirements of the federal government. Going into the output-based pricing system, so that's the federal system that applies to multiple provinces for large emitters. There's a few important updates or regulatory dates that are coming in the short term that I think it's important to kind of discuss quickly. So the federal government is developing a offset system currently. And that offset system is going to cover a wide variety of activities for emission reductions that will then have the ability to create federal compliance grade offsets. Again, we're talking about a system that's going to have a ceiling price of $50 a ton by 2022, so a fairly strong pricing signal for those emission reductions. The offsets typically trade at a discount to the prevailing ceiling price, but nonetheless, it's a much stronger price signal than what we see in voluntary carbon markets. September 4th, there is a formal deadline for input into the system development and specifically into looking at the input activities, how to prioritize them, where they have a pan-Canadian impact, so the types of emission reduction activities that they've included on the list, where that specifically impacts from a pan-Canadian perspective. Having that wider impact is something that's important to Environment and Climate Change Canada, and having substantive amounts of supply from those activities. So I do very much encourage organizations that have exposure to these markets to provide feedback into these key regulatory deadlines, because that is what helps inform the sandbox we're all forced to play in the future. Outside of that September 4th deadline, they're going to be looking for technical experts in respect to each of these emission reduction types of activities, and specifically generating rosters of experts that will then help feed into the development of the protocols that will ultimately create the environmental commodities. So again, to the extent that this is something that your organization is tied to from either a demand or supply side, I would certainly recommend engagement with the regulator for that September 4th deadline and providing your feedback into that process. The next piece would be October 1st. So we have a deadline for the annual report and verification for 2019 compliance. So anyone that falls into that regulation has to submit that report. And then they're going to have to pay any associated obligation that they have by April 15th of 2021. 2020 was also a key year for ECCC to complete an interim report on the Pan-Canadian Framework. So the Pan-Canadian Framework was the document that dictated how different jurisdictions in Canada needed to structure their programs to meet the minimum requirements of the federal government. This is a review year. I haven't heard a lot in terms of next steps on that project at this point, but it's certainly something that we should be apprised of and keep awareness to, because that can dictate how programs are forced to shift over time. And a key example of this is the minimum price on carbon. So systems where they would have otherwise kept carbon pricing at a flat level have to match the federal minimum. So that is a system requirement by the federal government. Having an understanding of what the federal government wants to do going forward and how the systems might be required to change, as an example, what's the stringency of your system, how much demand your compliance entities have based on the structure, are really important questions, because ultimately that has broad-based impact on market fundamentals and the carbon pricing for specific commodities. And just really quickly, because I want to switch over to, I'm sure, some really interesting questions that the group might have, a quick update on the Clean Fuel Standard. So we've seen a delay in the adoption of this system. Right now, in fall of 2020, we expect the liquid component, or the liquid stream of the CFS regulation, to be in CG1 with a 75-day comment period this fall, and then a final regulation by late 2021, and the regulation for the liquid stream in full force and effect by 2022. At the same time, in 2022, the gaseous and solid stream regulations will be drafted and consulted on, with an expectation of the final regulation for 2023. This is really important. We see very substantive prices for low carbon fuel systems across North America, California, BC. Now this is a pan-Canadian system. The pricing for this system is going to be capped for the credit clearance mechanism at $300 a ton, and the compliance fund at $350 a ton Canadian. So these are really, really comparable price levels to what we're seeing in some other jurisdictions like California, but very, very strong price signals, and certainly the development of these projects are predicated on those pricing signals. So really important to see how these regulations are set up and provide feedback into that process as they come to final regulation, and then obviously in full force and effect. So what's next? As an organization, it's really about measurement, management, and monetizing. So when you're looking at measurement, it's quantifying effectively into high degree of technical rigor those associated emission reductions. It's doing technical feasibility studies to understand if a technology can specifically create an environmental commodity. It's as a corporate footprinting what that looks like in terms of what your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are. This is really setting the framework for the creation of environmental commodities or the participation in the market to meet emission reduction targets. Then it's about managing. And some of these key regulatory deadlines that I mentioned are a key example of that. I spent many years working with clients and engaging with regulators around environmental regulatory design. I can't stress enough how important that is to be an active participant in that process, because it ultimately shapes a very, very, very substantial cost or benefit to organizations depending on their participation in these markets. And that participation engagement with regulators is critical to have an effective system set up and designed. Regulatory compliance, so it's participation in those markets to reach those regulatory deadlines, and project development, so it's the creation of those environmental commodities so that you can ultimately monetize them. So that's cost and revenue optimization, talking about that trading process in these opaque liquid over-the-counter markets, and specifically around project financing. So environmental credit streams and how you can contract for them can have a significant impact on the financing of the associated project. All those terms and conditions are mission critical for some of these projects. And our company and our team have worked with clients for over a decade in respect to supporting across this entire carbon value ecosystem. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Rod, and I'm really excited to hear everyone's questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chelsea. That was fantastic. We're now going to turn it over to the Q&A session, and I'll just remind folks again, if you have questions, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or that's where it is on my screen, you should see a little Q&A button. If you select that, it'll pop up a window where you can type some questions. So we've had a few questions roll in already, Chelsea. And the first one, and I think this is a really interesting question. We spend a lot of time thinking about environmental commodities relative to emissions reductions. But we often wonder, there are a number of clients that through the Innovation Hub we work with who are in the bioeconomy that have, a really interesting product that is maybe a recycled product. Its primary attribute may not be that it has, significant emissions reductions tied to it, but it has other environmental attributes that's tied to it. And one of the questions that has come in is, what does the market look like for those type products? Is there something that exists? Is it emerging? Or is it, not there at all today?
That's a great question. So the concept of environment, so if we look at offsets, there is a concept of what I would call charismatic carbon. So the co-benefits of these projects are oftentimes what is the overarching charisma of the specific credit. And certainly in voluntary markets, Rod, there's such a substantive difference in pricing between charismatic carbon and, I don't want to call it non-charismatic carbon. All carbon's a little sexy, but we're driving emission reductions that maybe don't have all of those co-benefits that come along with them. You have a very, very substantive difference in price signal. And so there is a willingness to pay for co-benefits. If you're talking about a project in and of itself that has and I should back up. Those are still on a per ton of CO2e basis. So ultimately, if you have very, very low emission reductions, you might have all the co-benefits in the world and you might get the highest price for voluntary carbon that's ever been seen. But if you have a very small amount of tons of CO2e, it still might not get you there. Mm-hmm. So the other piece of that is there is a concept of stackable credits, and it hasn't been fully fleshed out in all markets, certainly. It's something that's very, what I would call nascent. But the concept of being able to quantify the co-benefits, names like blue carbon, so when you're talking about specifically carbon around water bodies, there's a lot of different things that can be discussed over time that could create a market pricing signal. It doesn't mean that it's here today, but it's also, I kind of go back to, interestingly enough, especially when you're talking about voluntary credits, part of it is the market strategy and finding the right buyer for your commodity. So it's not a homogeneous market. It's highly differentiated. And so if you have something that is of value to a buyer in terms of what they're trying to establish for their organization, then the value of it can ultimately be predicated by that relationship. So it doesn't mean that we only see serialized carbon offsets trading. We certainly see unique situations at prices that can sometimes be surprising, but it's all about the underlying market participants and what you're bringing to the table in terms of value to their organizations. Certainly, if you have a serialized offset credit, it's easier. You just have a wider pool of buyers, but it doesn't mean that if you're doing something unique that it's completely off the table and at no point in time it won't have a price signal that would be attractive to drive it. The other piece I would say about recycling, because I had some personal involvement in looking at a recycling offset protocol, is it's also about disruption of virgin feedstock. So if your virgin feedstock has a high emissions intensity that would otherwise be used, and that's your business as usual case, you don't necessarily need to have an approved protocol in place. You could actually be part of an exciting in-setting framework discussion with a buyer. And that's where they're looking at their supply chain and saying, you know what, using your recycled product substantively reduces emissions versus using that virgin feedstock. And that could be something that in and of itself drives value and interest from a demand side.
Excellent. And that's really that's really insightful, and kind of leads to the next question. I like what you had to say about the offset credits, and I know that here in Nova Scotia Environment are in the process of developing their offset program as well. So timely that this is being looked at a national level. So I think that September 4th deadline is something that everybody should note, a little asterisk by from this presentation. Chelsea, I think part of the challenge for, you know, providing recommendations into the offset program is what exactly should you recommend? What do you say? And, you know, as we've been thinking about it, there are a number of our clients that I think fit well with an offset protocol that probably don't realize they do, you know? So we've got, as an example, a client who is able to divert organic waste from landfill and create a high value novel protein out of that product. And that's what their business is predicated on. But if you really think about what they're doing, they're diverting that organic waste from landfill where it would you know, create methane emissions, a very potent greenhouse gas. And I can't help but think that while they don't fit under, you know, a cap and trade program or a carbon tax program, that there should be a offset piece tied to that they could fit in. And so my question here is, what would you recommend if you're a business in that type of space and you think you might have an offset protocol play? What would you recommend that they recommend in any correspondence with policymakers?
Yeah, absolutely. So having been involved in offset protocol development for many years, because I ultimately started my career trading carbon where I had one of the largest demands in the market. So it was really incumbent to have as much supply as possible to meet that demand. It is a very lengthy process when the system is already in place. And so you have to have a high degree of confidence. And I would actually also suggest a strong stakeholder group that's supportive of the protocol to advance it. So when you're looking at Alberta as an example, there's a significant backlog of protocols that are in the queue. And recognizably, AEP doesn't have, you know, necessarily the resources to deal with all of that backlog. So it takes time. When you're looking at the federal system, because they're developing it right now, it's super valuable to be able to be at the forefront of making those recommendations. So they've released a document, they've given specific project activities, looking at that and saying, okay, within my project would fit within this, providing estimates on what would be the associated supply and what would be the pan-Canadian impact. So is it one project in one jurisdiction, or is it multiple projects that could scope across multiple jurisdictions? And I will tie back to the concept of, it's not about saying, well, we only have one project that's creating this protein, so therefore it doesn't have a pan-Canadian scope, because it's actually more about the organic waste methane reduction emissions, and then having the flexibility, like the end use projects, more of the flexibility piece. So you wouldn't necessarily, you would be lumped into a broader category, if you will. So it's the pan-Canadian impact of that entire activity, if you will, and the associated supply. Having an understanding of that and putting that information in front of the government so that that could be prioritized, because it has a substantive supply, ability to generate supply, technical rigor to meet the system requirements, and pan-Canadian benefit, certainly helps them when they're deciding how they're going to prioritize the different activities to create offsets under.
Excellent. Thank you, Chelsea. Well, I see that we're almost at time, and we have a few things that we need to get to. I'm going to offer the last word to you, Chelsea. You know, you're so steep in this. Is there any sage words of wisdom or thoughts that you have on, you know, where, for example, maybe the Green Reboot program is going, or where COVID-19 has impacted carbon markets, what they're likely to do in the future? So I'll leave it to you to leave us with some sage advice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm naturally very bullish on environmental commodity markets and humanity in general. I think that we are going to be driving amazing innovations into the future that's really going to get us to the targets that we need to get to. And that will take step changes and things that we don't know is possible today. So although the disruption that's been created by this situation, I'm not even going to touch on. I am excited to see the way we can effectively manage that going forward in terms of incentivizing the right types of innovation. And I'm very positive on that. I'm very positive on how environmental commodity markets are going to drive that innovation, because it's really about a price signal. I always say, let the innovators do what the innovators are going to do. Create the right signal and they will come. And so I think if we create the right signals, we're going to see that type of innovation. As a stakeholder group that's sitting at the table right now, I can't stress enough how complex environmental commodity markets are. So don't underestimate the amount of time and resources that are needed to focus in on the policy pieces, because there's so many moving pieces. And interestingly enough, we're seeing, demand internationally for certain activities that happen within Canada, that it wouldn't be necessarily transparent out of the gate that existed. So having people that are thinking about this, participating in the markets, it's so mission critical, and understanding that there's multiple pathways to monetization where you're looking at these commodities. So it's not, if you see a single pathway, it's also really important to understand the entire landscape and how you can optimize your participation in the market. Because the first thing you see oftentimes isn't the best thing. It might not be the 5th thing, but the 10th could be a massive step change. So really it's about understanding the complexities of the policy and the markets, and that, we're all in this together, so.
I think that last one is, well done. I think that's an excellent point, especially the last one. I mean, one of the things that I note is the difference in, carbon pricing associated with, a clean fuel standard versus that of a, cap and trade program. They're night and day. And so it pays to do your homework to figure out where do you fit best. So I think that's an excellent piece of advice. So with that, I would like to thank Chelsea. There's been a number of questions come in that we didn't get to. We'll try and follow up. Chelsea, I'm sure, is interested in talking with anybody that has an interest in environmental commodity markets. So feel free to reach out to her. If you are interested in this topic, I'm just going to plug another series that we've got coming up. The Radicle team and ourselves, as well as BioDesign, have teamed up to offer a Sustainable Revenues from Sustainable Products series that we'll be announcing shortly, and we'll likely see 3 sessions in September, October. So stay tuned for those. Those will focus on low carbon fuels. We'll talk about the insetting concept that Chelsea mentioned, and our hope is to have a panel session of customers and end users of low carbon products as well. I'd like to thank Chelsea for her time. It's fantastic. What a great job you did. Thank you so much. We know it's a commitment of your time and resources to be here, so that's greatly appreciated. I'd also like to recognize our partners, including BioNB, CCNB-Innov and Ignite Atlantic. And I'd also like to recognize Ryan Duff, who's working in the background here to make sure that our technical system works well. I'm going to put in one more plug here for the next Atlantic BioCon virtual speaker series, where we'll be featuring Dr. Stephanie McCory and Dr. Audrey Moores to talk about their work creating high-value products from crab waste and invasive crab species. Stay tuned for an announcement on that in September. And a final reminder, there should be a pop-up survey that comes up at the end of the session with a link to a survey that helps us understand how well we did and what we can do to improve. It's 7 quick questions. I'd ask that if you could complete that, that would be very helpful for us. And finally, a big thank you to everyone for tuning in. Please keep up your great work in supporting the growth of Canada's bioeconomy, and we look forward to connecting with you next time. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks.